wants to kill you, regardless of consequences.
This guy is, to my way of thinking, a vicarious sex criminal.
And now, on with the show.
Hello everybody and welcome to After the Film. Today we're doing a top 5. That is, top 5 slasher films. A few notes before we go. I'll keep this introduction short. 1. I did actually just rewatch all 5 of these movies to make sure I still wanted to include them on my list. So these clips were recorded over the course of about a week. So you'll see the shirt change, hair change. Take some time. Number 2. This is not my personal favorites list. I'll explain more on how I selected the movies as I go, but it's also not my idea of what the best slasher films are, or rather, it's not what the best films are that are slasher films. It's a little differentiation I'll explain better later. And number 3. These deserve a little bit of mention. My honorable mentions. 3 movies that didn't make the list, but are definitely must-sees if you're into slasher films. Scream. Postmodern response to slasher films, plays on knowledge of slasher films, has a good time. 2. Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. Another one that picks apart the tropes of the genre, or the subgenre, of the slasher film, and does it in a great way with this documentary being made about this new slasher killer. Great film. 3. The Final Girls. Again, plays on knowledge of slasher films. A group of teenagers end up inside a slasher film from the 1980s. Hilarity and horror ensue. Great movie. Not to be confused with The Final Girl, with Abigail Breslin, which right near the climax has about a 10-15 minute section that could have been a really great short film. Otherwise, not good. The Final Girls, plural. So anyway, let's get down to the top 5.
You have decent taste in slasher movies.
Red 5 standing by.
'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there.
There are 2 important things to know about Silent Night, Deadly Night. 1, it takes its time. It's 13 minutes in the first opening sequence back in 1971 when the kid's 5 years old and goes to visit his grandpa, and then on the way back his parents are murdered by someone dressed as Santa Claus. Set up the whole psychological premise of the film. Another 12 minutes when he's a few years older, 1974 I think, so he's 8, and he's at this weird orphanage with Mother Superior, who's kind of a bitch, and more stuff about his understanding of who Santa Claus is and what naughty means. And then finally 25 minutes till we get to the present, when Billy is 18. And another 10 minutes before he gets the Santa suit. And it is 45 minutes before Billy kills anyone. It's like right at the 45-minute mark he's killing 2 people. And for a slasher film, that's actually unusual, but that's what makes this one good, is that it takes its time dealing with this psychological drama and explaining who Billy is, why he's killing people, why he thinks Santa Claus is supposed to kill people. Because these people are being naughty. And that is the premise of any slasher film.
Punishment is necessary, Pamela.
Even before the film was released a couple of weeks ago, its TV ad campaign caused a furor with its brief depiction of an axe-carrying Santa Claus. But there's no question in my mind that the showing of Santa with an axe on free TV and commercials is sick and sleazy and mean-spirited. So let's repeat the names of the people who did it. TriStar Pictures, co-owned by Columbia Pictures, CBS, and Home Box Office. Shame on you. Let me repeat the names of the writer and director and producers of this film. Michael Hickey wrote the film, Charles E. Sellier Jr. directed it, and Ira Richard Barmack produced it. You people have nothing to be proud of, even if you made a few bucks off of all the negative publicity. Your profits truly are blood money.
And that's the second important thing. People hated this movie. Its promotional material included Santa Claus with an axe. And Siskel and Ebert hated it. Repeating the names of the filmmakers and shaming them. And Siskel and Ebert were wrong. I mean, Roger Ebert especially is one of my go-to film critics. I look at his reviews often. He didn't get slasher films. And that's fine. Slasher films aren't for everyone. But if they're for you, this is a good one. It takes its time. It's got a lot of skin if you're into that. It's got one of the classic slasher deaths when Denise, played by Linnea Quigley, gets impaled on deer antlers. And I won't show you that clip because, you know, nudity. Instead, we'll watch this.
Have you been good? Or have you been naughty?
Good.
You haven't done anything naughty?
No, Santa Claus.
Are you sure?
Something that really stands out in this movie, though, is that the fourth victim, Mrs. Randall, is actually smart. She hides behind some boxes. When Billy drops the axe, she picks it up, she takes it with her, she runs. She's trying to actually get away. She's thinking. And this is 1984 in a slasher film, so that's unusual. And it's amazing. One of the best things about Silent Night, Deadly Night is that it's fun. And it's bizarre in its ridiculousness. It's absurd. You see Santa Claus attacking and killing people. You see two different Santa Clauses gunned down in front of children. This movie is supposed to be weird. It's supposed to be dark. It's supposed to be funny. Just because conservative Christians and Siskel and Ebert didn't get it, doesn't mean it doesn't work.
4. Hello? Who's that? Oh, hi. What are you doing out in this mess?
1.
The original Friday the 13th, 1980. It's the definitive slasher film. If you want to know what a slasher film, this is where you look. You look to this series above all others. I'm still not putting it number 1 because some of the movies do it a little better. But this one defines it. And just like the dictionary is not a good book to read, but it's still a place you look to find out what things are. It's a weird metaphor, but it works. And it's got some of the basic stuff, like this introduces or gets more of the final girl. You had that in Halloween in '78, but you didn't have that in Silent Night, Deadly Night, for example.
Movies like this end when the final girl kills the bad guy and the credits roll.
You want to understand what the final girl is, a la Carol Clover? Then this is a movie you look to. Alice is a great example. Like Laurie in Halloween, Nancy in Nightmare on Elm Street, Sydney in Scream. Alice is a very good example of what that final girl is. Friday the 13th also starts getting us into the sort of archetypes of the slasher film. The various character types, the virgin, the athlete, the whore, as Cabin in the Woods calls it. And it starts to separate these sort of ideals of who the characters are going to be, and you'll see them repeated over and over, especially in the Friday the 13th series. And a lot of the other slasher films that have come in the meantime. The other thing you get is the eye camera that goes back to like the granddaddy of the slasher film, Peeping Tom, 1960.
He invades the privacy of innocent people till the piercing eyes of his camera meet the terrified eyes of his victims.
You get that first-person POV of the killer, and that's a big part of what the slasher film is. Unlike other horror films where the horror is outside of us, the slasher film often puts us in the position of the killer. It gives you that thing so you can relate to either side. And lets you identify where you need to identify. I'm not saying you identify with the killer and that everyone who likes slasher films is some horrible person, you know, the kind of thing that, I don't know, I guess Siskel Ebert would have supported. But it's wrong. It's not how it works. Something interesting in Friday the 13th that wasn't in Silent Night, Deadly Night is what Richard Knoll, in his book Blood Money, calls the, I think it's the leisure section of the structure of the film. The slasher film takes its time to show the characters living, to show the characters playing, to show the characters interacting. And with the slasher film, often that ends up getting them in bed so that they are naughty. And they deserve to die. That's one way of looking at the way the slasher film is structured. There's a lot more to it, and we'll get to that with the next film. One thing that actually separates Friday the 13th from a lot of other slasher films, especially all of the other Friday the 13th films, except maybe A New Beginning, is that it is also structured like a whodunit. What's the Agatha Christie thing? 10 Little Indians, I think? An even more racist title originally, but that's the usual one people refer to it as. Or And Then There Were None, where it's about these people in a location, one by one being picked off. One of them is the killer. Spoilers for, you know, decades old film. We aren't introduced to the killer really until near the end of the film. But that's the way the structure works up until that point. And that's interesting. As for this movie itself, the kills are nice. You have the classic one with Kevin Bacon before he was famous. There's not a lot of skin, although there is the implication that there could be with the strip monopoly game, which I still don't understand quite how that works in terms of money. Of course, there is the infamous beaver shot. Sorry, I had to. All in all, what you have is a movie that is a defining piece of the subgenre of the slasher film. Still, there are other films that are better versions of that definition.
Who are you? The Three Amigos!
Halloween night. A small American town. 15 years ago.
Now, Halloween, and this is where this discussion is going to get interesting. Halloween doesn't spend much time in the past. It's only 7 minutes with the opening sequence, and then we're all in the present, and it takes its time. It's a slasher film. It gets to that Blood Money thing from Richard Knoll, where he talks about the leisure moments. We spend a lot of time with these characters before they die. Performances are great. From the obvious, Donald Pleasence, Jamie Lee Curtis. They did plenty of other films, but even the lesser actors in other parts do a good job. There's a thing going around online. I don't know the original source, but supposedly the virginity good, sexuality bad element of Halloween was not deliberate. The way Carpenter and Hill structured it was that simply put, the sexually active characters were a bit too distracted to be aware of their surroundings. Whereas Laurie Strode, because she's this babysitter on high alert for the kid, and because she's not busy with a boyfriend, or she's more aware. She's able to pay attention. Whether it's deliberate or not, and going back to Clover, that doesn't mean it isn't there. Like, it doesn't serve a purpose, and it isn't still a commentary on something. The question is, what is that commentary?
I'm convinced it has something to do with the growth of the women's movement in America in the last decade. I think that these films are some sort of primordial response by some very sick people of men saying, get back in your place, women.
Oh, and he's right. I think Siskel misunderstands the slasher film a bit, but he understands why it exists. In my blog, I wrote about slasher films for a month straight. It was 33 slasher films in 31 days, and the basic idea you get from this whole lot of them is there is a reason they exist, a reason they came about in the 70s. And yeah, it's a response to the women's movement. But I think what Siskel and Ebert miss is this idea that somehow the film is arguing against the women simply because the earlier parts of the film seem to be against the women.
You've said before that all movies tend to argue in favor of the behavior that they show.
No, that's bullshit. That's like saying the Book of Job is anti-man. Like, it's anti just because bad things happen. No.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. May God have mercy on your soul.
The point to the film is when you get to the ending. Yes, the structure is we are enjoying, maybe, this violence against women because of this response where we're threatened by the women's movement, we're threatened by women being independent. And it's the independent women who get killed. But it's also the independent woman who saves the day. It's the independent woman who is the final girl who comes back and kills the killer. Of course, maybe it's a bit of poetry then, political poetry, that the killer often comes back for another film. Because that just makes sense. That conflict between the men and women, this is a huge gender thing, keeps going.
Once it was out there, once it was in theaters, there's no way that they could suppress it. There's no way that they could cover it up.
In fact, there's an interesting thing in Friday the 13th with the head counselor, Christy, and in this movie with Dr. Loomis. There's this sort of father figure that is supposed to be saving the girl in trouble, yet he doesn't. Christy returns to the camp and is immediately killed. Loomis shows up way too late to save much of anyone, shoots Michael Myers, and Michael Myers gets away. I mean, never mind the sequels. The structure of this film is that Loomis didn't really do much. Laurie was doing a pretty good job on her own, with the knitting needle, the hanger, the knife. She was probably going to manage. There's another example of that sort of structural thing, is the way Kubrick dispenses of Halloran in The Shining. This savior that's supposed to come and save everyone and can't. And this is important also to that women's liberation response. It's not about saying it's wrong. It's about saying, yeah, you can be on your own, but then you're not going to be protected by the men anymore. And as long as you're okay with that, it's not necessarily a negative thing. So the big question, why isn't Halloween my number one? I mean, so many people would say, it'd be like their immediate choice, Halloween, best slasher film. It's a couple things. One, there aren't a lot of victims. And in terms of a slasher film, you need that. You need that setup where a lot of people are dying for doing bad things. I love that we don't get much of a motivation for Michael.
The blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
He's this sort of force of nature. And that's awesome. But, in the end, Loomis does have to save Laurie. She was doing a pretty good job on her own, but the movie is structured so that he's there to save the day after standing around all night, even though Michael gets away. That's not necessarily a plus. And that drops it down a notch. Definitely under my number 2, as you'll see when we get to that. The other thing, there's not a lot of the, maybe it's that it's too early. Like, I wasn't going to put Peeping Tom on this list, even though obviously we don't get the slasher film as it is without Peeping Tom. We don't get the slasher film as it is without Psycho. We don't get the slasher film as it is without Halloween or without Friday the 13th. But defining the genre and being the best of the genre are not the same thing. Maybe it's that Carpenter's music, while so evocative, is a bit too simplistic. I don't know. I like his music, but I understand the complaint. Or maybe it is just that there's not enough here. We get a lot of that leisure moment. We get great setup with the trophies at the end of the film. But as I said, there's not a lot of kills. Michael kills 5 people during this movie. That's it. And when it comes to a slasher film, body count matters. Of course, I think my number 2 has fewer people die. Go figure.
2, we have smoke detectors.
The kids of Elm Street don't know it yet, but something is coming to get them.
There's something out there, isn't there?
You could just see cuts happening.
What did that, Lieutenant?
I don't know.
Nancy Thompson is not the same as other final girls. You know, coming back to Clover, she is, I mean, her name is more feminine. Clover points out a lot of final girls have tomboyish characteristics, names that could also be male. I don't know of any men named Nancy. But also, one of the things that Clover talks about is that in the final act of the slasher film, the final girl picks up the phallic weapon, the knife, and she uses it like the male killer does. She stabs him. The thing about Nancy Thompson, though, she doesn't. She uses her brain. She sets traps. She puts her arms around Freddy to pull him out of the dream so that she can put him in those traps. These are not masculine acts. And this is a big reason why I put A Nightmare on Elm Street above Halloween, above Friday the 13th. Because it changes what the slasher film is while embracing the rest. Honorable mention, of course, to Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which came after the Freddy Krueger series was pretty much over, because it takes that same concept and turns it into something even bigger, where this evil is coming out of the film. And it becomes something structurally not a slasher film, while still having the series of deaths and this thing coming after people.
Nightmares come in different forms, at different times, for different reasons. Now, Wes Craven, the man that knows them better than anyone, is bringing you something new.
It's smart, it's scary, and it's curiously thought-provoking.
It didn't provoke a single thought in my head.
Come.
No, Roger, they put in these people who you and I know, and so it's kind of campy fun to see them in their real life roles on the screen. But at the core level, this is a mad slasher movie.
In terms of theme, in terms of structure, Wes Craven's New Nightmare is not a slasher film. And in a way, A Nightmare on Elm Street is not either. It's dealing with something else. It's dealing with with dreams. It's dealing with the subconscious. It's dealing with guilt. It's dealing with more of that psychological stuff we saw in Silent Night, Deadly Night. And unlike a lot of other slasher films, you get more of the involvement of the parents, the adults. Still, like Loomis, like Christie, Nancy's parents are not useful in this movie. Her mother is an alcoholic who can barely function. Her father is a police officer who, it's not that he's bad at his job as a police officer, but he's bad at his job as father. He's not there to help when he needs to be. And that's deliberate. This is a movie that takes the slasher film idea with that being about teenagers. I mean, this is important. Slasher films are not about adults. They're about people who have not fully grown up yet, who have not fully matured. And they're trying to figure out what life is about, trying to navigate the world. And they don't fully know how. This is important. And that's where the gender roles get rolled up into this. So that what it means to be masculine is something that the male characters are still figuring out. What it means to be feminine is something that the female characters are still figuring out. And when it comes to the final battle, I mean, Clover deals with these killers in slasher films as not being fully masculine. That's a discussion for another day. But that's the thing, is the final girl is not fully feminine either. Or is she? Kyle Christensen, in an essay entitled The Final Girl versus Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street, proposing a stronger model of feminism in slasher horror cinema, has a great line about Nancy Thompson. Nancy is a feminist final girl and the first and best model of feminism in the classical slasher film. And this is why I put A Nightmare on Elm Street above Halloween. Laurie Strode falls very much in the feminine version of the final girl. Even her choice of phallic weapons, I argued in my blog, was about feminine things. The knitting needle, the hanger. Even the knife is a carving knife from a kitchen. Michael's choice. But still, Laurie taking it up is not necessarily masculine. Sometimes a phallic symbol is just a knife. But then Nancy doesn't use a knife. Nancy uses a sledgehammer. Nancy uses a lamp that explodes. Nancy uses a coffee pot. Again, from the kitchen. And Nancy uses her wits. Nancy is more of what we need in a slasher film. Someone uses their brains rather than simply fighting violence with violence. There's still some violence to it, of course, but it's intelligent. Performance-wise, Heather Langenkamp is one of the weak points of A Nightmare on Elm Street, which is too bad because her character has a nice arc to it. She figures out something's wrong right away. She figures out she can do something about it, and she does something about it. And she, as I said, she doesn't use the phallic weapon. She uses her brain, and this is good. This is important. This is something we need in a slasher film. And we don't need just the girl standing up for herself. We need the final girl to stand up for herself and do something like Nancy. Turn her back on the monster. To reject it. Not to defeat it on its own terms. Don't just stab it to death. In the larger structure of the franchise, stabbing something to death doesn't work. Jason Voorhees gets back up and comes for another film. Michael Myers gets back up and comes for another film. Freddy Krueger gets back up and comes back for another film. Maybe that disproves the point.
There can be only one.
3 times before, you have felt the terror, known the madness, lived the horror.
That's right. My number 1 top pick for slasher films is Friday the 13th, the final chapter. And I'll tell you why.
Our next movie is Friday the 13th, the final chapter, an immoral and reprehensible piece of trash.
And no, it's not, because it's an immoral and reprehensible piece of trash, because it is absolutely not that. Siskel and Ebert take this dangerous position in a special they did on women in danger films, they called them.
Artistry can redeem any subject matter.
Sure.
That's why I've always been opposed to censorship. I don't believe any subject matter should be off base.
I say that's a dangerous position because this means if I like the film and I think it's artistic, it's good. And if I didn't like it, it must be bad. This excuses any way you choose to judge the film. If you choose to call it immoral, you choose to call it reprehensible, it's fine because you didn't enjoy it. One more clip.
Friday the 13th, the final chapter, is 90 minutes of teenagers being strangled, stabbed, impaled, chopped up, and mutilated. That's all this movie is.
He says that like it's a bad thing. What does he think the audience wants from this movie? He also refers to this movie as a cynical retread of the previous 3. When he didn't like the first 3, I'm not sure why it matters. But what we get is the previous 3, for this audience, have built up to this moment. At the time this movie is made, there was actually pretty good reason to think this could be the final chapter, the last movie with Jason Voorhees. And it works as one. Story-wise, let's get into this. Okay, first one takes place 1979 on Jason's birthday. I believe the movie says it's June, but by calendars it should be July to be Friday the 13th. Second one takes place 5 years later, same day. Again, would have to be July 13th. The third one picks up right after the second one ends. The fourth one, this one, the final chapter, picks up right after that one ends. So essentially, the second, third, and fourth are this long killing spree over the course of about a week. So in terms of the story, it's one big thing about Jason Voorhees coming back for revenge because he saw his mother killed 5 years ago. And the urban legend-ish way of telling things that they got in the second one, and you see in a clip at the beginning of this one, suggests that he has been doing other things in the meantime. He has been hurting other people. We just didn't pick up on the action until the camp opened again in the second one. And why does this matter? Think about it like this. Roger Ebert calls this a cynical film and is worried about the teenage audience that's coming to see it because it doesn't matter anymore if you have hopes and dreams. I should have cut this whole clip, it was really long. It's talking about, like, it doesn't matter if you have hopes or dreams because you're just going to end up dead anyway. It's 1984. That is the mindset of young people as it is, because you have the height of the Cold War, you have Reagan as president, you have wars in, like, I forget the exact years for these things, but Grenada and Nicaragua, you just had Vietnam last decade, we've had World War II, we had the violence of the 60s. Roger Ebert was on the front lines for some of that violence when he was writing for the, I forget what the name of the newspaper was, but in Champaign, Illinois. I quoted him in one of my papers on the sexual revolution. In 1984, on Friday the 13th, the final chapter, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Silent Night, Deadly Night all came out. 3 of these in my top 5. I was 8 years old. The only one of these I saw in the theater was A Nightmare on Elm Street, and that was actually only half the movie because my mother thought it was too much and we left. Not my choice. As soon as I had the chance to see it on television, I saw it on television. I didn't see a Friday the 13th movie in the theater until the 8th one. Jason Takes Manhattan. By then I had seen all the previous ones. Similarly, Nightmare on Elm Street, I didn't see another one in the theater until Wes Craven's New Nightmare. By then I had seen all of the other ones. Halloween, on the other hand, we kept up with that series. I don't know, for some reason my mother was okay with that one. What's my point? There's this notion that somehow the audience of a violent film is inherently violent, or the makers of a violent film are inherently violent. Never mind one, the possibility that they are not violent because they make these things, because they put these things out there. They exorcise these demons by making these films, and society exorcises its demons by putting these films out there, by going to see these films. America is a violent society, and constantly we mix sex and violence, and slasher films embrace this mix. That violence and sex go together because they are both these base, instinctual desires. Civilization tells us that one is wrong, violence, unless it's acted out militarily against another civilization, because that's okay. Civilization tells us that the other is wrong when it's in public and should be kept in private in the bonds of marriage and be nice and wholesome and only to produce children, which has never been realistic. And here I am defending slasher films in general when trying to explain why this one is number 1 on my list. And I'm not saying it's my favorite slasher film. For example, I love Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. I think it is a much better film than most slasher films, but I don't think it does as good a job at being a slasher film. They include those 4 campers as a tangent, and that's the closest the film comes to being that slasher. It tries to be something bigger and good for it. Just like Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Still has a little bit of that slasher structure, but it's trying to be bigger, and that's why Roger Ebert liked it, as we've already seen. And I loved it. Wes Craven's New Nightmare. And I enjoy a lot of slasher films. I enjoy a lot of horror films. I enjoy the immoral and reprehensible pieces of trash that they are. The idea that artistry can redeem any subject matter is patently ridiculous when artistry is subjective. On the other hand, I agree with it. Artistry can redeem any subject matter. However, I think it's much... You need to be more open to artistry if you're going to try to make that argument. And this film is artistic. It deals in shadows, it deals in fear, it deals in these ideas of who we want to be and are going to be. These young people are worried about who they are. It seems crass, but the notion of, like, what's his name, Crispin Glover's character being a dead fuck is a big deal to him, because it is a challenge of his masculinity, a challenge of his humanity, in terms of simplistic, youthful sexuality. And I think that frightens some people. And I don't mean in the way that a horror film frightens some people. I mean in the way that the existence of a horror film frightens some people, that we could be entertained by this. Of course we're entertained by this. This is what we try to do in reality all the damn time.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
More kills than Halloween, Friday the 13th, or A Nightmare on Elm Street, or Silent Night, Deadly Night. This is important as a slasher film. Has the final girl, which Silent Night, Deadly Night does not. Adds the younger brother, which puts an interesting twist on it. It's not just about feminism, it's about this idea that family is winning. The weird thing about slasher films is that it's conservatives who don't like it, but the slasher film is hugely conservative. It's about punishing people for being sexual. It's about punishing people for being immoral. And then in the end, in this case, the family unit wins. It's implied that the mother has been killed, but we don't actually see it. And so you have the sister, and you have the new recurring character who's going to be in the next 2 installments of the series. Tommy Jarvis, introduced as a 12-year-old boy who is really smart and talented in this film. He makes his masks and his puppets, and he knows a lot of stuff, and he's a nerd. So, gotta appreciate that. I do. So why is this one better than? Not better than. This isn't my personal favorite list, as I've already said. It's like, if you want to understand what a slasher film is, and you have time to watch 5 movies, you watch these 5 movies, you'll understand. This is a good example of what a slasher film is, partly because it doesn't try to have some great moral lesson that it tells you. That's not what a slasher film is about. It's about this fundamental, primal urges of sex and violence versus the urge to survive. By having more deaths, by having, oddly enough, in 90 minutes, still taking its time with the opening at the hospital, which is 14 minutes, taking its time with the leisure section, going back to Blood Money. The movie creates tension because we know these people are going to die, and by the time of this 4th installment, there are people in the audience who are cheering on those moments because they want to see the great kills. They want to see something like Kevin Bacon getting the arrow up through his throat. They want to see something like the lovers getting the spear through them in the second one. That girl, by the way, is the sister of the character in this film, who he keeps talking about dying. He talks about it like it was years ago, and it was really last week in terms of the setting. And that death is biblical, by the way. The spear through the lovers in bed. That's straight out of the Bible. Slasher films are at once accepting of difference, with all their different types of characters hanging out together, and favoring good. If you made it all the way through that, thanks for sticking around. If you bailed out, I guess you're not watching this part, so I'm not talking to you. But thanks for sticking with me. It got a little long-winded and got a little serious, a little argumentative. Really, what's great about horror films and slasher films is that they aren't the serious drama of so many other films. They're more about fun. If you want to understand slasher films, go watch these 5. The 3 I mentioned at the beginning. Throw in Peeping Tom, Psycho, maybe throw in a Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original. Have a good time. And if you don't like slasher films, go watch something else. See more movies. See movies you wouldn't normally see. Good night.
You're killing me, Smalls. You have no idea how much cardio I have to do. It's ridiculous.
Why so much?
There's that whole thing of making it look like you're walking, and everybody else is running their asses off.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment.